So this is going to be a rather quick review of some of the character types that you just learned about in the video that you just watched, although there will be some different things in this presentation. The first thing we want to discuss is the difference between major and minor characters. Major or main characters are exactly what you'd expect them to be. They are featured heavily in the story's action and they are important. Minor characters aren't as important, so why are they there? Well, all characters, even the minor ones that might seem to be irrelevant to the plot, do play an important role in the story. And it's usually our job as readers to consider what their role is and why the author thought it important enough to put them in. A lot of times, minor characters play a role in stories in order to either create or relieve tension, to shine a spotlight on the main character through interactions and give us insight into the main character's personality. It might even help to reveal a theme, minor characters. And then sometimes minor characters show an opinion or an attitude that's similar or different to the protagonist. Now, what is a protagonist and what is an antagonist? The protagonist is the leading or main character in a story. Hopefully, you've heard that word before. The antagonist is a person who opposes, struggles against, or competes with the protagonist. Now, the antagonist is not necessarily a villain, but usually it is a character who plots against the protagonist, or usually a character who is against the protagonist is depicted in a negative way. So here's an example of an antagonist who's not a villain. Catwoman, if you are familiar with any of sort of the Batman series, The Dark Knight Rises in particular, Catwoman opposes Bruce Wayne or Batman, and therefore that makes her the antagonist. But she is inherently good and really cannot be considered a villain. So not all antagonists are villains. Okay, it's just someone who goes against the protagonist. Now we're going to talk about dynamic versus static. This is a very important thing when you're considering characters. Dynamic characters change in a significant way through the course of a story. They learn something new or they gain a new outlook. And this really models after us in real life. We constantly are changed by the experiences we go through. This picture here hopefully will help you understand dynamic. It's colorful, it changes, okay? Versus the idea of static. Static characters don't change in a significant way. They remain the same. So think of static stays, okay? It's a character that does not experience a change. Similarly, we have round versus flat. Round characters seem like real people in the sense that they have lots of characteristics, personality traits. They're the kind of really well-developed character that we know a lot about. We get a complete view of who they are throughout the story, a very round, complete view of them. So flat characters are very one-dimensional. We rarely know much about them. Versus a round character, we know a lot about them. Okay, that comes into play. You can imagine how similar these are to major and minor characters, round and flat. You can see a lot of similarities in these terms, although they have slight differences, these terms. A foil character is a character in a story who contrasts with the main character. Why are they in the story? They're in the story to highlight one of the main character's attributes. So maybe the main character has certain personality traits or like something like intelligence or some sort of good nature or something like that. There will be a character who is pretty opposite of that, who's like the role that they're in the story for is to stand in contrast to the main character. Just like tinfoil is reflective, you can think of the foil character like that. It's there to reflect the certain personality traits that they want you to notice of one of the main characters. So let's use this as an example. Lord Voldemort from the Harry Potter series, or should I say, he who must not be named. Haha. Okay, so he is an antagonist, Lord Voldemort is, and he also happens to be a villain. But in the series, he depicts evil and bad, and he's constantly shown as someone who's mocking love and all things good, and he thinks of all of that as foolish. He's portrayed as ugly and dark and evil. Among other things, one of the main purposes for even having a character like Lord Voldemort in the Harry Potter series is specifically to highlight the good in Harry Potter. By Lord Voldemort being so bad, it highlights the good in Harry Potter. Therefore, Lord Voldemort is a foil character. All right, now we're going to talk about something called character archetypes. Now, this might be new to you. In the video that you watched, that person called them character stereotypes, and that's like a synonym here. We're going to call them archetypes. That's more of the literary term that we want you to use. Basically, an archetype is a typical character that represents universal patterns of human nature, some sort of universal symbol. As the more and more you start to read, whether it's young adult literature or even as you start to read adult literature, you're going to start seeing the same sort of types of characters come up over and over. Now, there are dozens of character archetypes, and you will learn more about them in 8th grade. Here in 7th grade, we're just going to go over a few of the major ones. So, the hero, that is a major character archetype. The hero is a character who usually exhibits goodness and struggles against evil in order to bring harmony or justice to society. So you can think of like Hercules, you can think of Harry Potter. It's just that typical hero story. Okay, we also have the archetype of the caregiver. Sometimes people call it the mother figure, regardless of whether it's a male or female. So the caregiver archetype is the person who guides for or cares for another person. So think of like the fairy godmother in Cinderella, okay? Or think of Dumbledore in Harry Potter. And then we have the archetype called the innocent youth. And this is the kind of character who is inexperienced and has a lot of weaknesses, but others like this character because of how trusting the character is. So think of Snow White. She trusts everybody, but she's very inexperienced and sort of like, has a lot of weaknesses. So that would be the innocent youth archetype. The mentor. This is the archetype of a character. You see this a lot in literature. It's the person who sort of protects the main character and gives a lot of wise advice and helps the main character out. So Dumbledore, again, in the in the Harry Potter example, might be considered the mentor. Also, Haymitch, if you've ever read the Hunger Games series, and if you haven't, you need to. It's so good. But Haymitch definitely is a mentor, okay? All right, and then we also have the villain archetype. This is one of my favorite ones. I love a good villain story. This is a character whose main function is to go against or try to defeat the hero. Example, Voldemort in Harry Potter. The villain archetype is inherently also going to be the antagonist of the story. So we're going to watch this quick example. Hopefully the sound comes through okay through my speakers here.
Long ago, there lived a sweet girl named Ella. She lived with her mean stepmother and her 2 proud stepsisters. They made her do all the housework. She was always covered in dust, and so she was called Cinderella. One day, the prince invited all the girls in the kingdom for a ball in the castle. Everyone, including the 2 stepsisters, was very excited. Cinderella, too, wanted to go to the ball, but her sisters asked her to stay at home and work. Cinderella was so disappointed that she began to cry. Suddenly, she saw a shimmering light in the room. A woman with a kind smile stood in front of her. She was Cinderella's fairy godmother. She wanted to help Cinderella go to the ball. With a wave of her hand, she created a grand carriage and made Cinderella look like a princess. The fairy godmother warned her to be home before 12 o'clock, for then the spell will be broken. Cinderella was the prettiest girl at the ball. Her stepsisters didn't even recognize her. All the other girls were very jealous because the prince danced with her the whole night. However, the moment the clock struck 12, she remembered the fairy godmother's words and ran away. In her hurry, she left one glass slipper on the castle steps. The prince had fallen in love with her and wanted to find her and marry her. He asked his men to go to every house in the land and find the girl whose foot fits into the glass slipper. The king's men reached Cinderella's house. The 2 stepsisters tried hard to get their big feet to fit into the slippers, but in vain. Finally, when Cinderella tried the slipper, her foot fit perfectly into the glass slipper. The prince and Cinderella were soon married in a grand ceremony. The wicked stepsisters never bothered her again.
Okay, so depending on your level of familiarity with the Cinderella story, That, may or may not match up with what you know. But basically, we just did that for a quick practice. What archetypes are present in the story? Match the archetype to the character, or rather, the other way around. So we've got Cinderella, the wicked stepmother, the prince, the fairy godmother. We've got the innocent youth, the mentor, the villain, and the hero. Which would go with which? If you said this, then you're correct. Really quickly. So, Cinderella, the innocent youth, right? The wicked stepmother, the villain. The prince we have marked as the hero. Now, depending on how you want to interpret this, like some people don't, like he didn't do that much heroic stuff to her. He was almost just like a hero by default. He did rescue her from her horrible life and all of that, but it was almost by default. So you could argue that if you wanted. The fairy godmother is definitely like the mentor, or even in some ways you could call it the caregiver, which is a different archetype. Okay, so hopefully that made sense to you. At this point, you're going to be doing your character types practice, which involves you taking the characters from the Velt and really analyzing them. You will definitely need to use some textual evidence, but not direct quotes. You can just use paraphrasing, and you'll find that on Schoology. Good luck.